The Michigan Wolverines have been one of college football's most dominant teams over the previous 3 seasons, and they have dominated the Big Ten, being the best of the best in the Big Ten Conference over the past 3 seasons as well. The Wolverines have had a 40-3 win-loss record since 2021. They have won 3 Big Ten championships, a national championship. They are 2-2 in college football playoff games, losing in the semifinals in 21 to Georgia and 22 to TCU, but beating Alabama in the semifinals in 23 and beating Washington in the national championship game in 23 as well. Michigan, under Jim Harbaugh, and for parts of last year also now Michigan head coach Sherrone Moore, have on average produced 9 NFL draft selections over the past 3 NFL drafts, totaling 27 players, 4 of whom were taken in the first round. And they have many potential future first-rounders on their roster now, even though Michigan lost a plethora of starters, the majority of their starting roster and the majority of their production from 2023 to graduation and to the NFL draft. The only program nationally who can compare with Michigan in terms of success and dominance, and they actually surpass Michigan a little bit in both, is the Georgia Bulldogs under Kirby Smart. That's the only program who has done more than Michigan over the previous 3 seasons. Georgia has made the college football playoff in 2 out of the previous 3 years, in 21 and 22. So Michigan's actually more consistently appeared in the college football playoff than Georgia has. If the expanded playoff rules were used, that wouldn't be the case. But to their credit, Georgia plays in a tougher conference, and their conference championship game is not a dud, unlike how the Big Ten championship game has been, where Purdue and Iowa both in 21 and 23, Purdue was in 22, they had no shot of beating Michigan when they played in those games. And had Ohio State won the game instead of Michigan in all 3 of those seasons, well, those teams wouldn't have had a shot to beat Ohio State either, and it instead would have been Ohio State with a guaranteed spot in the college football playoff for those 3 seasons. And the only team in the Big Ten who can relatively compare to Michigan is Ohio State, and they don't compare with Michigan in the same way that Georgia does. Georgia has a similar style. Georgia is 42-2 over the previous 3 seasons. Michigan is 40-3. Georgia and Michigan have won their conference and participated in all 3 of their conference championship games over the previous 3 seasons. And Michigan and Georgia have a national championship. Georgia actually has 2 over the previous 3 seasons. Ohio State has none of those. No playoff wins, no conference championships, no conference championship game appearances even. And Ryan Day and Ohio State, I've talked about them before. I think they are a elite program. I do think Ryan Day is an elite head coach, and I like what he's done, and I don't think that he's a failure like some people say. I don't think that he's on the hot seat, although he is facing pressure. And all these things about Ryan Day and Ohio State are a topic for another video, though I bet that many Michigan fans watching this right now are eating this up, because Ohio State over the previous 3 seasons is 33-6, which is definitely, and I mean this, that's definitely inferior to 40-3 and 42-2. That's certainly inferior. And they are ultimately 24-3 in the Big Ten Conference. Michigan, 9-0, that's 18. They are 26-1 in Big Ten Conference play over the last 3 seasons, with their only loss coming to the Michigan State Spartans, led by Kenneth Walker in 2021. My case in point is Michigan is dominant. They have been dominant. And the question is, can they continue to be dominant? And what's made Michigan's dominant run so fascinating is while Georgia last year was second in team talent composite with almost 1,000 total roster points. This is from 24/7 Sports Team Talent Composite. They take the star ratings of high school players, and hopefully they adjust these to, factor in performances in college and not just high school recruiting rankings, because with the portal and with team examples like Clemson and Michigan, high school recruiting is a good indicator of success, but it's not perfect. And I think in part it has become an overrated aspect of the whole winning process and dominance process, even. Again, still very important. I've mentioned this before, and people act like I don't care about recruiting. I do, and I wish that my school, the Michigan Wolverines, would recruit inside the top 5 and recruit like Ohio State and Georgia. And I hope, by the way, that Ohio State and Georgia continue to recruit the way they do, because having teams that are dominant and have the potential to be that good every year, having pillars and a foundation of, some teams are going to be good, is refreshing. Dynasties are impressive, and they are in part needed. Michigan has not been top 3 in roster talent in any of these past 3 seasons. In any of them. And you could argue that maybe factoring in development and returning production and college performance they have, but purely by high school recruiting rankings, they have not been. And last year, they were 14th in team talent composite with about 850 roster points. Ohio State was 3rd with 975. Georgia was 2nd with 978. Alabama was 1st with 1,015. They actually had, I think, Saban's most talented roster ever by high school recruiting rankings. And that almost brings me to a side point of it's understandable why Saban retired. The previous 3 years under Alabama were 13-2, 11-2. That's 24-4, and then 12-2 again. That's 36-6. And while that is impressive, and most programs would kill for that, no national championship, competing for one in the 2021 national championship, or technically the 2022 national championship game. It's weird how the college football playoff names all that stuff. But in retrospect, that was a game where Georgia, they really began to pull away in the fourth quarter and show that they were the better and more complete team. And the 22 and 23 teams, they wouldn't have won it all. The only reason they were even in that conversation was because of Saban's coaching. The coordinators, the assistants, and even the talent on deck, I think was just overrated and not up to the Alabama standard. Georgia, they're dominant, obviously, and they'll continue to be with Kirby Smart, their staff, and their recruiting. Ohio State has been good, too. They've actually been great, and I'd say an average of near elite or elite over the past 3 years. But Michigan, despite having inferior high school recruiting and not having the same amount of just player resources, and by player resources I mean Ohio State has 4 stars and 5 stars, and same with Georgia, same with Alabama. Michigan mainly has 3 stars and 4 stars, so they kind of start off at a disadvantage, and part of that is to their own fault, a lot of it is, and yet they still beat these teams. They've beaten Alabama once over the previous 3 seasons, the only time they've matched up. They've beaten Ohio State 3 times. I think they would have given Georgia a run for their money in 22. I think they would have beaten them last year. We obviously saw what Georgia did to Michigan, though, in 2021. So how does Michigan do it? They're, I think, the number 1 team by development over the previous 3 seasons by a mile. No one over the past 3 seasons, no one at least that I am aware of at the Power 4, Power 5 level, outside of, you could say, maybe Utah, who's done very great things with Kyle Whittingham with the roster that they have. Kansas with Lance Leipold, I think another great example. Oklahoma State with Mike Gundy went to the Big 12 championship game in 21 and 23. But those are just a few names, and they haven't won national titles or even participated in the college football playoff, though Oklahoma State was very close in 2021. Michigan's won national championships, won their conference 3 years in a row. They've been on, honestly, a run that if Harbaugh stayed, some people could be talking about this could jumpstart a dynasty at Michigan. How do they do it? They're the number 1 developmental team, and can this continue? These are the 2 questions that I hope to somewhat answer in this video. And before we continue, I want to give out a plug and encourage you all to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts on this video as you continue to watch down in the comment section below. I also want to thank my patrons for sponsoring this video and channel. I will name them at the end of the video, but here they are on the screen. If you want to support the channel in an extra way, you can purchase merchandise on my merchandise store. There are $13 t-shirts, very cheap, big sale. It's on until tomorrow. So for, I think today and for the rest of tomorrow, though I could be wrong, there's discounts there on the merchandise store for you to get College Football with Sam merchandise. And also, you can check out my Patreon page via the link in the description and the pinned comment, where you will also find the link to my merchandise store. Starting in a few weeks, there will be more consistent bonus Patreon content, but I'm really busy with school, with YouTube, and also with another part-time job and some other things. So the content that's posted on there is really sporadic, but it's a way to support the channel. And if you're a Heisman member, you can directly message me, and you also get signed College Football with Sam merchandise, which Crash2488, a Heisman patron of mine, has received his signed College Football with Sam t-shirt. So if you want that, you just have to be a Heisman member for 6 months. And all American members and Heisman members get access to the bonus content and articles when it releases. If you just want to support the channel in a little way, you can sign up as an all-conference member, and your name will be featured at a break point in the video and at the end of every video. But let's get back to it. The offensive line has been the main focal point of Michigan for the previous 3 seasons, and it's a big part of their dominance, and it also shows how good they've been at development. Michigan has not had a single 5-star offensive lineman in their 3-year run from 21 to 23. They haven't. In fact, Michigan has really struggled to recruit 5-star offensive linemen, even high-level 4-star offensive linemen. But Sherrone Moore has done a great job of recruiting, I'd say by Michigan standards, on the offensive line. Several 4-stars, a lot of 3-stars. Michigan always signs a lot of offensive linemen. And Michigan right now leads the NFL with 14 active offensive line players. And many of these players date back to the beginning of the Jim Harbaugh era. Some of them do, others, a lot of them, in fact, are more recent, but 14 active offensive line players on NFL rosters, first in the nation there. And Sherrone Moore, in particular, has been responsible for this, responsible for the elite execution of Michigan's trench play on the offensive side in college, development that gives these players great insight and tactics, better strength, conditioning that helps lead them off to the NFL. Ben Herbert has also been Michigan's secret weapon, the best strength and conditioning coach in the country over the previous 3 seasons. And I really use that previous 3 seasons benchmark just as a side note because it's after the COVID year. I take a lot of things into account for the COVID year. I think that without the COVID year, Michigan likely doesn't have this 3-year run because Michigan, with some non-conference opponents and extra preparation time due to the fact that the season isn't shut down, they probably perform better in a normal 2020 season than they do in the COVID year, and therefore Jim Harbaugh maybe isn't as incentivized to make the same changes that he did after the COVID disaster, but we'll never know. That's becoming very hypothetical. I typically care about 4 to 3 years of normal seasons from the past of a team, especially if there's any type of continuity. For teams like Colorado, you might as well throw out everything before Deion Sanders got there because, case in point, they're using the transfer portal, changing the rosters, there's little staff continuity, etc. But for Michigan, even with a lot of different staff changes, with many of Michigan's assistants from last season following Harbaugh off to the NFL, and with a lot of roster attrition from starting positions, a lot of Michigan's second stringers, some of their starters, and overall most of their roster is returning for this season. And factoring in portal commits, Michigan is returning 40% of their production. Sherrone Moore is back. Grant Newsome is back. Ron Bellamy is back. These are assistants or coordinators from last year who are still on the staff in similar or different capacities. Sherrone Moore obviously being the head coach. Grant Newsome moved to the offensive line coach. Ron Bellamy is still the wide receivers coach. And Michigan, I think, made even some upgrades as well. For example, bringing in Tony Alford to replace the outgoing great Mike Hart. But circling back to the offensive line, this has been Michigan's area of expertise, their strength. They've won the Joe Moore Award back-to-back in 21 and 22, and even though the offensive line in 2023 wasn't up to that same standard in the regular season, when it came to the postseason, where the 21 and 22 offensive lines honestly looked like they were in a slumber, Michigan's offensive line, especially in pass protection and against Washington, also in run blocking, they dominated and they ate. And Moore, being the head coach and keeping Justin Tress, who was Ben Herbert's second in command with the strength and conditioning program, I think you're going to see more of the same. I think that the offensive line, especially with several second stringers who've received playing time, who've received Moore's coaching, and some great recruits, 4-star level recruits who are receiving elite development, I think this offensive line this year and in the future, from what I can tell, is going to remain great. Michigan's offensive line in 21, 22, and 23 functioned, if not all the time, certainly at multiple times throughout the year, they functioned like an NFL-level offensive line. And the Wolverines are dominant because of that. Their coaching, development, and depth and strength, their power along the offensive line has helped them win games, control games. It's the reason why they were able to control Penn State last year on the road, despite the fact that Penn State had a massive matchup advantage at defensive end to Michigan's offensive tackle, because Michigan just pounded the rock. They said, okay, fine, your pass rush is elite. It's the reason why you have the best rushing defense in the nation statistically, is because Penn State they sack teams so much that they produce negative totals for opposing rushing yards. They did that against Maryland and Michigan State. It was pretty incredible. So we're just going to run the ball on you. And we're going to take away your ability to get to our quarterback, because we're not going to use them unless it's for occasionally running the ball or maybe doing some play action occasionally to keep your defense a little honest. And Michigan controlled that game. They could have won that game by more, I think, if they had maybe a different game plan, maybe if Harbaugh was still there. But again, that's hypotheticals. What matters is that they won. Against Ohio State, Michigan's offensive line led a drive where they took nearly 7 minutes off the clock, and they converted 3 of 3 fourth downs. 2 of them were running the ball, and every stinking time they ran the ball when they needed to convert, whether it was a 4th down, a 3rd down, or just keep the chains moving, Michigan's interior offensive line pushed Ohio State's interior defensive line by about a yard or 2 or maybe more. And Blake Corum, whether it was a touchdown or a conversion, got done what he needed to get done. The offensive line has been so key for Michigan's success, and that's a part of the reason why they have been dominant. It's the epitome of the fact that Michigan is elite at developing players at all levels, 3 stars, 4 stars, 5 stars, and it's Michigan's identity. And I think you can say the same about the defensive line as well. Michigan is tied for first with Alabama for the most active NFL defensive end players. Now, they're not even in the top 10 in active defensive tackles, but Michigan returns 2 first-round defensive tackles from what projections are saying in Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant, who I think are all-American, certainly all Big Ten caliber players entering this season at defensive tackle. Elston did an elite job. Mike Elston, former Michigan defensive line coach, he did an elite job in 22 and 23 developing the defensive line. And I expect Lou Esposito to have similar levels of success, especially given the return of Kenneth Grant, of Mason Graham, Rashawn Benny, Josiah Stewart, and Derek Moore. Michigan is deep. They are deep along the defensive line and have a lot of experience, a lot of playing time. They even have a good amount of starts in Mason Graham. And also, again, Kenneth Grant, Josiah Stewart, and Derek Moore played a lot last season. And again, looking at the trenches of both the offense and defense, where's Michigan's strength? It's on the interior. It's at defensive tackle for Michigan, which actually was a weakness in 2021. It was the weaker part of the defensive line in 2022. It became the strength of the defensive line last year, which I think is a big part of the reason why they won their playoff games. In 22 and 21, TCU and Georgia were able to abuse that weakness on the inside of Michigan's defense. Alabama had some success running, in part due to Jalen Milroe and Jace McClellan and Roydell Williams and Jam Miller. Really great group of players who can run the ball. But at the end of the day, when it mattered most, we all know how Mason Graham had that huge tackle for loss in overtime. And outside of some big runs, Alabama had a hard time. You know, they weren't pushing Michigan around. They had a few breakaways, a few good plays, and give credit to Nick Saban and that Alabama offensive line. But you also have to give credit for Michigan for holding their own on the defensive side of the ball as well. And the secondary and the pass rush coming mostly from the defensive line, we barely even need to talk about that. They sacked Milroe into the ground, and Milroe couldn't complete a forward pass for the most part in that Rose Bowl game. Against Penix and Washington in the national championship game, Michigan's defensive line was able to get pressure on Penix. The defense overall held Penix to just around 5 yards per pass attempt, and Washington only ran the ball for 46 yards and averaged 2.3 yards per carry. And a lot of these players on the defensive line, more than on the offensive line, who lost all of their starters, they return. So I think this is the number one defensive line entering the season. I don't think it's really close. I know that Ohio State returns more production on the D-line than Michigan does, but Michigan's D-line was clearly better than Ohio State's last year, and Ohio State's was good. In fact, it was better than good, but Michigan's was elite, and Michigan returns their strong points on the defensive line, which helps too, again, in Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant. Michigan's identity on defense, I think, has been more about defending the pass than it has about getting to the quarterback or stopping the run, but just straight up secondary play. Especially when you take into account that Ohio State, when Harbaugh was trying to beat Ohio State back in the 2021 preseason, that was Ohio State's strength, was passing the ball with C.J. Stroud and with Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, Jackson Smith and Jigba. The world didn't know about him much, but in 2021 he led them in receiving yards. And you also had Jeremy Ruckert at tight end and a great offensive line. And Henderson, as the season progressed, he was a competent pass catcher as well. So Michigan built their defense to stop Ohio State. They did. But then they ran into problems. When they encountered teams who were better at running the ball or had a desire and were better tactically at scheming ways to run the ball, they ran into problems like Georgia and TCU in the 21 and 22 semifinal games. Now I wonder, with Wink Martindale being more blitz heavy and aggressive than I think Minter and McDonald were, and with Michigan's secondary, at least from a depth perspective, being the weak point, I think in terms of starting caliber play, they're probably stronger than linebacker, maybe even as strong as the defensive line, but depth-wise, they don't have a lot of depth outside of their starters and maybe some of their two-deep positions with the Wolverines secondary. I wonder if Michigan's identity on defense is going to be about pass rush and stopping the run, if it's going to be about that defensive line. Because under Jesse Minter and Mike McDonald, the identity seemed to be about the secondary. And at times about the pass rush, but of course when you have Aiden Hutchinson and David Ojabo, why wouldn't Michigan's defensive identity be about them? In 22, I think it was definitely the secondary. And this year, with Mikey Sainer still and Will Johnson, there were great players along the D-line. But at the end of the day, I mean, Michigan's secondary was vicious. And don't forget about Will Johnson, too, who's also predicted to be a first-round selection in the 2025 NFL Draft. So Michigan could have 3 defensive players as first-rounders for the upcoming 2025 NFL Draft, which is basically a year away, so I don't want to talk about it too much. But Michigan's defense, specifically their defensive line, has been dominant, and combining that with an offensive line that's been dominant is why Michigan's won a national championship, why they've dominated the Big Ten, which is a trench-centric league, especially on the interior. Guard, center, and defensive tackle, I think, are more likely to win the Big Ten than offensive tackle and defensive end, Maybe I'm wrong, but that's just how I see it, especially since Michigan has been better and more talented at guard, center, and defensive tackle than, let's say, Ohio State has. But Ohio State has had Nicholas Petit-Fryer and Paris Johnson Jr. at offensive tackle. They've had better NFL-built, higher-ceiling offensive tackles than Michigan has had. At defensive end, they've pretty much always recruited better than Michigan, and historically under Larry Johnson have developed better as well. And yet, Michigan's 3-0 against Ohio State over the previous 3 seasons. I don't know how much that determines those results, but I think that is something to pay attention to, is that being strong overall in the trenches is important, but really if you can get the interior of the O-line and defensive tackle, if you can get those positions right, you can control the Big Ten, and you can control every game in Big Ten conference play. Again, it'll be interesting to see if that continues this season, and maybe Oregon and USC with their offensive firepower, they might have something to say about that. They may try and do what Ohio State almost did in 2021 and 2022, which is take over with offense, except maybe they'll succeed, as USC has an elite defensive staff, and we'll see what they can do on that side of the ball this year. And Oregon has really good players on the defensive side of the ball as well. Overall, what happens with Michigan this year? That's the question that we all are asking. That's the question that a lot of people are asking, and many are providing different answers. Can they be dominant in 2024? I think they can, but the question is, will they? Hypothetically, they have the players. They have the returning, I would say, depth and starters on the D-line. They have the returning depth on the offensive line. And you look at Michigan, watching the spring game, taking into account the team that they were last year, taking into account that the coaches are not just developing starters, they're developing the backups. And you look at Michigan's roster, the areas of biggest concern are quarterback and wide receiver. The offensive line, while it may not reload, is certainly not going to be a bad unit. Tight end looks great. Running back with Donovan Edwards, Khalil Mullings is good. The defensive line, as we've talked about, with Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, Rashawn Benny, Josiah Stewart, and Derek Moore, that's going to be a strong unit. And the secondary with Will Johnson, Quentin Johnson, Makari Page, Jaden McBurrows, Jair Hill, and a plethora of other transfers. I think that they're going to be strong. I loved what Michigan did in the portal. It was late. Part of that was not Michigan's fault, with them being in the playoff, winning it all, and then Jim Harbaugh leaving when he left, and by then the winter portal window was already closed. But Michigan did do things in the portal, and they got, I think, enough additions to where their secondary now has depth, and they even have some potent starters, and that's important. Michigan brought in 9 transfer portal players as a part of this upcoming cycle, and they brought in the secondary Wesley Welker from Louisville, Jaden Mangum from Michigan State, Ricky Johnson from UNLV, Amir Hall from University of Albany. They brought in Josh Preby on the offensive line from Northwestern, Jayshawn Barham at linebacker from Maryland, Dominic Zvada, a kicker from Arkansas State, C.J. Charleston, a wide receiver from Youngstown State, and Amorian Walker, a wide receiver, formerly at Michigan as a DB, but they're going to have him back at wide receiver from Ole Miss, where he was there for spring ball. Not an elite portal class by any means, but enough to where you get the sense that Michigan is trying to improve their depth and that they are also confident in the starters that they have. Speaking of dominance and what we talked about that I think that best is a causation, or at least correlates with dominance the most, especially in the Big Ten, is trench play. The only team that I see with comparable overall trench play, and particularly physicality, which relates a lot to trench play, is Oregon. Oregon did a great job in the portal. They added Jamari Caldwell and Derek Harmon to a defensive tackle room that I think needed upgrades, and they returned Jordan Birch at defensive end. Their defensive line should improve. It handled the offensive line well in the spring game. And Oregon returns Josh Connerly Jr. and a Johnny Cornelius at offensive tackle. Their offensive line is going to be elite. The question for Oregon is really at guard and also part defensive tackle due to the incoming transfers. But I do have confidence with their coaching staff that they will develop players at a great level there. So, looking at how they performed in the spring game, who they were as a team last year, what they're bringing back, I think that Oregon is a very physical team, and I love what Dan Lanning is doing. Ohio State and Texas, other teams on Michigan's schedule, are close. Texas is going to have a veteran offensive line, but they have questions on the defensive line. And for Ohio State, they have a veteran D-line, an elite D-line, one that is potentially comparable to Michigan's, but they have questions on the offensive line. So I think because of that, they are a step behind Michigan there. And everyone else on the schedule is definitely behind Michigan in terms of trench play and physicality. And with Donovan Edwards and Khalil Mullings and Benjamin Hall in the backfield with Michigan's O-line, their rushing attack should be one of the best in the country. And they'll have one of the best run defenses and pass defenses as well, with the players on defense that they return, that they've added, and some that haven't seen the field much but have been well developed in their time in Ann Arbor, that will be making some of their first starts or playing some of their first inaugural snaps this season. In total, the offensive line and defensive line do lose 7 starters, which is a lot. That's a lot to take in. Depth will be lost, but the starters that do return will be elite, and I think that there's a chance for some breakout players on the defensive line and the offensive line this year as well. Games that will tell us a lot, I think, are Michigan versus Texas in week 2, and Michigan versus Oregon as well. By the time that the game comes around with Michigan and Ohio State, as long as we look at things through an objective lens, we will likely know what these teams are, because neither Michigan or Ohio State have cupcake schedules this year. Last year we knew what Michigan and Ohio State were, at least I did, entering the game. In 2022, I feel like in 2022, and especially in 2021, Ohio State was still remembered as just being so dominant over Michigan that people couldn't look at the rivalry objectively. Like, that was still factored in, that Ohio State just owned Michigan. And last year was the first year where people said, well, Michigan's won 2 years in a row. They have home field advantage and they return more. So even last year at the beginning of the year, people... I hope I'm making sense in what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, and maybe it was just me, but the aura of Ohio State owning the game and the aura of Urban being undefeated against Jim Harbaugh and against Michigan was still firmly planted in my mind in 21 and even partially in 22. But by 23, that completely wore off, and it still wore off this season. Ryan Day still has to prove he can beat Michigan, but Sherrone Moore needs to prove that he can command Michigan and beat Ohio State and beat Texas and beat Oregon and at least compete for a Big Ten championship and national championship again, which I think Michigan certainly is capable of doing. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Remember to like, subscribe, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts on this video down below. Thanks to Crash2488 for being a Heisman patron and sponsoring this video and channel. Thanks to Spencer Bringhurst, Chris Lane, and Connor Little OH for sponsoring this video and channel as All-American members. And thanks to Will Loftus, John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Janisha Cockrell for sponsoring this video and channel as all-conference members. Have a great day, guys, and I will see you all very soon. Bye-bye.